As anyone who's ever extended credit knows, a lender always faces the possibility of non-payment by the borrower, or what's technically referred to as a default. While the reasons for a default might vary from situation to situation, the end result for the lender is, at the end of the day, the same. It's the partial or perhaps even total loss of what was loaned. Now, these types of losses might seem to be more acceptable to us for those with whom we share some kind of bond of affiliation, at least under the premise that while they may have defaulted on this loan, they might return the favor or in the future. But this is much, much harder to do with perfect strangers. And so in situations where loans are made to strangers, there tend to be much, much more tightness around the kinds of terms and conditions that apply. Now, in general, there are a few different ways that lenders can try to protect themselves from the losses associated with a default. And that's what we'll be exploring in this current video. So the first one that I want to discuss with you is the threat of punishment, the possibility that if a loaned funds or loaned resources are not returned, that there will be some kind of, how do we say, a negative tort or some kind of positive punishment that is incurred by the borrower. Throughout history, I would point out that the fate of errant borrowers has been terrible compared to the kind of fate that modern defaulters face. In the 21st century, particularly in Canada, we find that it's relatively easy for people who are unable to meet their obligations to simply walk away from them or declare bankruptcy. But historically speaking, this was a much, much more challenging proposition. For instance, you can see the image on the top of the slide here, what's labeled as the Prison Debtors Tower from 1790. If you can't read it, the sign, which was outside of Oxford Castle, states that the tower was built to imprison debtors who owed money. A rare triangular stone staircase leads to the 4 floors, divided into cells, some with fireplaces. Most importantly, prisoners remained in prison until they had paid their debts, and long stays were common. In fact, in the Clink prison, that dates back to the English medieval period, people who were imprisoned for their bad debts were not even fed. They literally had to beg through the windows of the prison for food from passerbys and hopefully from their unimprisoned family. So needless to say, the opportunity to simply declare bankruptcy and start again in the modern world is a significant change from how things used to go in human societies. In fact, if we take a look at a number of ancient world societies, what we actually find is that throughout the Bronze Age, the notion that debtors could be forced into slavery until they could repay their debts was in fact quite common. Even in the modern world, we still see significant threats of violence being brought against debtors who fail to pay. In 1923, for instance, France invaded Germany, which is not commonly recognized by people, but Germany had failed to pay their war reparations from the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, and France felt that Germany was intentionally dragging its heels, had the ability to pay, but refused to. So they invaded the Ruhr Valley region that falls between France and Germany effectively shut down all of its industrial production in protest, which led to the German hyperinflation of the 20s. But it's worth noting that the first step in that story was the invasion of Germany by France to collect on war reparations that had not been paid. In a somewhat more extreme example, also from Europe, in the late 1200s, early 1300s, an important bank in Siena, in Tuscany, failed. Unfortunately, caught up in the failure of this bank, effectively someone who had borrowed from their depositors, were the King of France and the Catholic Pope. So when the bank failed and there were lengthy bankruptcy proceedings, what was done in the meantime was that Philip the Fair, the King of France, decided to seize all of the Sienese people who were living in his kingdom and imprison them until the city of Siena could render full payment of all of the deposits he had made. This led obviously to the punishment of completely uninvolved parties, but was done as a way to try to force affiliates of these captured Sienese people to find a way to make France whole. So needless to say, punishment is one of the tools that people have used throughout history to try to dissuade the possibility of a default. Another technique used to try to reduce the possibility of defaults is guarantors. Guarantors include things like student loan cosigners, microfinance borrowing groups, even organizations like the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, which provides a guarantee on Canadian mortgages in the 21st century. So guarantors effectively agree to take on the debt obligation for themselves should the original borrower fail to pay. Guarantors are typically someone with whom the borrower shares a bond of affiliation, and it's their hope of the borrower, or sorry, the hope of the lender, that the bond of affiliation with the guarantor would lead the borrower to default fewer times than if they were simply borrowing from a stranger with no recourse being levied against their affiliates. um, but guarantors are not the only technique. Another one that helps to reduce the possibility of non-payment is the use of collateral. Collateral effectively involves either the upfront transfer of an asset in exchange for a loan or a promise to submit some various assets to the lender in the event of a default. In other words, if I don't pay you back what I borrowed, here's something else in exchange. Now, the kinds of collateral that could be used to secure debt has changed over time. In ancient Sumer and Assyria, you could use your own body and freedom, and that of your wife and children could be used as collateral on a debt, which led to plenty of debt slavery, which we'll be addressing in a little bit. In the Roman imperial period under Augustus, the city of Rome was willing to lend to its poor at no interest, as long as they were willing to pledge assets that they owned that were worth double the loan, effectively enabling people to secure a loan against their asset without requiring them to sell that asset for whatever price they could get in the immediate term. By the 5th century, we see monasteries along the Silk Road beginning to make collateralized loans to the poor. These types of loans were generally at low interest, often no interest, mostly secured by the threat of supernatural punishments as opposed to punishment of affiliates. But within a couple of hundred years, we actually see pawn shops or secular secured lending beginning to appear in the Tang capital of Xi'an. In fact, at the top of the screen here, what we have is a receipt from a pawn shop dated over 13 centuries ago from the Chinese imperial capital. Goods were provided as collateral in exchange for loans, the details of which can be roughly made out if you can read ancient script. And the sort of 7 slash across it was a traditional way of noting that these obligations had been discharged. Now, for those of you who are wondering how a piece of paper survives for 13 centuries, I would encourage you to explore the following text. You may be able to see this pretty well. The Origins of Value, Financial Innovations that Created Modern Capital Markets, conveniently assembled by the same William Goatsman who wrote our textbook for this course. And in this book relays the story of funeral dolls, which were discovered in the desert near Kashgar in the last 100 years. The paper coffins that had been used to inter people in the desert and some of the paper funerary dolls actually managed to survive 1,300 years simply because of their completely desiccated state. And when archaeologists were exploring what's called the Astana graves dig in the same western regions of China, they actually uncovered that many of these paper coffins or paper funeral dolls were actually made out of receipts and old pieces of parchment written on both sides in many cases that had been discarded from the Chinese capital and then shipped west to these paper recyclers effectively. So paper recyclers have given us the evidence that collateralized lending existed in the Chinese imperial capital as early as 13 centuries ago. In a more modern sense, we see the Muscovy Company, one of the great British trading companies of the 16th, 17th century, was able to secure a 4,000 pound loan directly from the government in 1568 by securing it with hundreds of tons of cables and ropes, which could be transferred to other international shipping companies. So you'll recognize right away that the quality of collateral turns out to be particularly important, because even if a lender does seize your collateral, they themselves will then need to liquidate this collateral and turn it back into some kind of usable resource for them. And the reason collateral is often so high and expensive compared to the underlying asset is because of the difficulties that lenders would have turning these kinds of hard assets back into liquid assets. Now, today we still have collateralized lending. In fact, you might recognize that many bonds or formal debts of corporations are secured by hard assets, things like factories or inventories. But as consumers, we also encounter the requirements for collateral when we see things like liens on automobiles or mortgage lending that's secured by the house we buy, or even a secured credit card. The final piece of technology that we use to try to reduce the default is to charge interest. Interest is a very old concept that has been with us for literally thousands of years and presumably arises from the agricultural nature of the kinds of monetary assets which were being lent out in the early Bronze Age. In fact, looking at the etymology of certain words reveals the financial aspect of them, as well as pointing out to the agricultural roots of these financial concepts. In general, if I were to lend you, say, a herd of cows for a year, who do the offspring of the cows belong to? If I provide you with a loan of wheat and there is seed in this wheat, and you're able to plant that seed and grow more wheat, to whom does the yield of that asset belong? So the ancients addressed this in a variety of different techniques by assigning a portion of asset growth to the lender, effectively recognizing that the lender, if they had maintained the asset themselves, would have seen growth in the value or in the quantity of that particular asset. And so the borrower is expected to make the lender whole for the use of that asset. For instance, if we take a look at the Sumerian word for baby cow or calf, the term they use is mash, which is the exact same word that they use for interest. Even if we look a little bit at the more modern techniques, in ancient Greece, the term tokos was used to mean both birthing and interest. And so you can see how the roots of charging interest actually derive from the agricultural nature of what was frequently being lent. The tablet that we see here at the top of the screen, what's called the Derham tablet, actually shows the compounding effect of interest. There's a mathematical error, interestingly enough, which Goatsman points out in the text once you read through it. But the Derham tablet here is a calculation of compound interest on a loan that's based off of the idea that a herd of cattle will naturally reproduce at a particular rate over time. So if I were to lend you, say, 100 cows for 3 years, the Derham tablet would give us some idea of the number of cows I would expect to receive in exchange when you finally repay the loan. Now, of course, an unconstrained rate of interest can very easily become a problem in society. And so in the Code of Hammurabi, which is not the earliest law code, but one of the early law codes that we have discovered, it dates back to 18th century BCE, so about 1772 is archaeologists' best estimate. But in the Code of Hammurabi, they actually set down interest rate caps. A loan of silver was capped at 20% a year, while a grain loan was capped at 33%. We can see why the differences might appear here. First off, loans of grain would all be paid back at harvest time, when all of the lenders pay back their loans simultaneously, potentially depressing the value or the trade exchange value of this extra grain. Meanwhile, silver would retain its value over time and be a little bit more stable in terms of its value, whether it was harvest season or not. But grain also carried a higher interest rate on the expectation that grain contained seed that could be planted. And therefore, the idea was that the borrower could, in fact, grow more of their own money in the same way that someone who borrowed cattle could effectively breed more cows out of what was borrowed. So to account for the natural growth in these kinds of agricultural forms of money, as well as the price fluctuations throughout the harvest season, the interest rate on grain was generally set at 1/3. Now, the kind of compounding that the Sumerians engaged in was not the kind of exponential growth that we see today. Instead, what they did is they had particular periods of time after which the principal was assumed to double. So even though if we were to calculate a 20% interest rate today, what we would end up doing is compounding that 20% over and over each year. The Sumerians instead say that at 20% interest, until we double the principal, interest is straight line. So effectively, a 20% rate on a loan of silver means that in 5 years' time after you borrow it, you will pay me back twice as much silver. Meanwhile, grain loans were capped at doubling every 3 years. So rather than having a compounding 33% rate of interest every year, what it meant is that the principal increased by 1/3 each year until it doubled, and then all of that interest was capitalized, meaning that after 3 years, a grain loan will have doubled, but after 6 years, a grain loan will have quadrupled, doubled again. After 3 more years, it would be 8 times the original amount. And this actually leads to the cascading titanic amount of interest that Goetzman identifies in the Entemena column that is discussed in the textbook, where they start demanding trillions of liters of grain from a city-state who has stolen some land from them. Now, interest is not only used to try to prevent people from borrowing or to dissuade them from borrowing for trivial matters, but the idea is that interest paid on some loans helps to offset the losses for a lender who lends to an entire portfolio of borrowers. If I charge interest on 10 borrowers, 9 of them pay with interest, but the 10th one defaults, then the gains from those other 9 people can help to defray the losses that the lender incurs on the one that defaulted. It also provides a disincentive for people to simply frivolously borrow. If interest is prohibitive and interest is high, people only borrow and invest when they think there is a real opportunity to do better or when they are under very dire circumstances. And it's this relation with people who fall into dire circumstances that led to a significant reevaluation throughout the Middle East about how to deal with high interest rates and people that had fallen into debt slavery. And so there are a number of different attempts to address these sorts of problems throughout the ancient world. In particular, though, there are limits that are often put on charging interest to try to effectively build up a sense of community between borrowers and lenders, to effectively move a loan back towards more of a gift as opposed to necessarily a service for which a fee would be charged. So interestingly enough, the first example we see of this is under Deuteronomic law, the book of law discovered in the Temple of Jerusalem around 620 BCE, in which the ancient leaders of Israel prior to 600 BC had apparently been given strict rules by their deity related to how they were to treat one another. This is effectively the great book of law that reforms Judaism in around 600 BC, ostensibly bringing them back to a more authentic or Moses-based sort of relationship with their deity and each other. So it's worth noting that in Deuteronomic law, Jewish people are not allowed to charge interest to other Jewish people, which effectively shows that religion can form a sort of super community or a super extended family in which the bond of affiliation is expected to be extended to other co-religionists. Interestingly enough, however, interest could be charged to non-co-religionists, which means, of course, that people outside of your community are treated differently than people within your community. In other words, I might charge interest, for instance, to a foreign government that borrowed money from me, but I might not charge interest to my brother when he borrows money from me. And this attempt to encode these kinds of restrictions into religious laws basically makes all your co-religionists and extended family who are due, according to religious law, special considerations due to their belief systems. Now, interestingly enough, a non-religious version of this appears just a few decades later in classical Greece. Athenian archon Solon passed a variety of decrees to reform Greek society, and one of these included the law that Greeks could not own Greeks, which put an end to centuries of debt slavery, at least for Greeks, which had gone centuries without any kind of manumission or remission of slaves. Now, of course, we do see other religions, particularly monotheistic religions from the same part of the world, following on this kind of prohibition against interest. In the 7th century, Islam, which is effectively 2 steps removed from Judaism, also creates a prohibition against interest, except it's much wider. This is no longer a prohibition against interest to simply co-religionists, but a prohibition against charging interest in general. The complication comes in from the uncertain definition of the term riba, or usury. Usury is often regarded in many ancient texts as being an excessive rate of interest which is charged. but it's not really clear what constitutes an excessive rate of interest. It's clear from the archaeological record that rulers like Hammurabi attempted to set a limit on what was considered usurious or not. And in fact, there were significant punishments for anyone who, under Hammurabi, who tried to charge more than the legally mandated rates of interest. But nonetheless, it was seen by the 7th century under Islam that charging interest put the lender in a position where they could be morally compromised. And the notion is that if I charge you regular interest on a loan and something bad happens to you through no fault of your own, through no moral failing whatsoever, something prevents you from being able to pay, you were injured, there was a bad harvest, etc. Under traditional Sumerian style interest, we don't really care what happens to you, you just owe the interest because the asset was lent to you by someone who no longer has use of it. On the other hand, we also see this notion that co-religionists are part of our broad community and that there should be limits on the amount of interest that gets charged. The Sumerians are pretty clear about this, right? If you fail to pay your interest, it's simple, debt slavery. On the other hand, under Islam, they decided that because lenders ran the possibility of gaining from the misfortune of others, that this would necessarily taint the loan and make the loan effectively morally reprehensible. There's also the notion of gains from nothing, which is problematic under Islamic Sharia law. So things like broad speculation in the value of debt securities is not something which is allowed. Gains from nothing and the concept of riba or usury created ultimately a different kind of debt mechanism under Islamic law. And this is what we call a sukuk in the modern world. And sukuk is a big deal. Sukuk has markets of approximately $400 billion around the world as of last year. But of course, the constraints around lending under Islamic law have complicated this. Sukuk is not strictly speaking a form of debt, it's a form of profit participation, which makes it more akin to equity that has been repackaged to function like debt. Nonetheless, there are some key differences. The first being that, of course, there are no fixed obligations, no collateral that can be seized, and of course, the lender runs significantly more risk under an Islamic sukuk system than they would under a Western or Sumerian style interest system that comes with fixed collaterals. Under sukuk, if a default occurs, the assets can of course be seized by the lender, but only proportionally. And this means, of course, that you are participating not just in the gains from your loans, but also participating in any potential losses from your business. And this was seen as rinsing away some of the immorality that was associated with profiting from the misfortune of others. These kinds of prohibition against interest appear and disappear throughout history, including in Islamic countries. In fact, in the Ottoman Empire, loans at interest were a fairly common thing, but we've also seen periods where loans at interest were completely forbidden under rather strict religious rules. One of the most modern rulings on this, in 1977, there was in a large conference of scholars which provided a widely regarded declaration that all interest was riba. Rather than trying to argue about what was morally acceptable interest, they simply declared that interest was never morally acceptable. Simple as that. Nonetheless, some modern financial scholars, particularly those who are trained in Islamic jurisprudence, have begun to advance the notion that an inflation level rate of interest would be acceptable under Islamic law in order to compensate people for the steady devaluation of paper currencies, which occurs by the design of modern central banks. So in that sense, charging 2% interest to accommodate the fact that currency is worth 2% less is arguably less problematic than charging fixed interest, which could result in profiting from the misfortune of others. Now, of course, Christianity had a similar sort of back and forth wrestling with the concept of charging interest, and many early Christian leaders in the medieval period decried usury entirely. Thomas Aquinas is famous for this. There are a number of other important early Christian thinkers which feel that any kind of interest being charged is similarly profiting from the misfortune of others, and therefore charging interest was technically banned throughout Christian countries for a number of centuries. This results mostly from Charlemagne, who puts in a ban on charging interest in 800 in order to effectively virtue signal his way into having the support of the Pope, who would thereby declare him a Roman or Holy Roman Emperor, as opposed to simply being a very successful Frankish warlord. Now, ultimately, in Europe, the scarcity of capital and the financing needs of various weak states leads the governments of the day to begin borrowing from people and, of necessity, paying them interest in order to bring capital into their social systems. And over time, this moral constraint against charging interest eventually weakens to the point where capital markets actually become significantly developed in the Christian world. And this leads to a major divergence between the economic fortunes of Western Christian nations and literally everyone else around the world who had tried to decry the use of interest. Now, I should point out that the decrying of interest happens in many different religions, not simply monotheistic ones. Vedic Buddhist texts, or Vedic texts rather, not Buddhist, Vedic and Buddhist texts both decry the excessive charging of interest and decry usury, but there are no formal prohibitions against charging interest in these religions. Only a notion that people should be reasonable in the rate that they charge as compensation for the use of their money. Nonetheless, through all of this, we can see that the social layer in finance works to constrain the purely mathematical. That even though it may be purely mathematical for Entemena to claim trillions of liters worth of grain from another city-state that had stolen a patch of land a couple of generations before, socially, we tend to want to use that as a guide, but ultimately make decisions that are in the best interests of our communities. And this has been done in a lot of different ways by different people around the world. So I think it's important once again to recognize that while we might mathematically optimize by charging interest, seizing collateral, requiring guarantors, and even possibly punishing errant borrowers, there are frequently social limits that we should consider when attempting to apply these sorts of constraints onto borrowers as well.